File Services, Part 4. In this nugget, we'll be talking about file services. This is Part 4, where we'll start off by talking about the volume shadow copy, which is a great and dynamic way to keep up-to-date data backed up for your users. And it's kind of an on-the-fly way of being able to not only back up the data, but also to restore it very quickly and efficiently. But it's not good for archival purposes. For that, you'll need to move on to something like Windows Server Backup. We'll start off with just an overview of Windows Server Backup and how it works and what some of its advantages are. And then we'll take a look at a backup configuration. I'll actually show you how to set that up. Once it's been set up, we can then create a backup, and I'll show you how to do the backup and also show you how to restore the data. And then we'll take a look at some WBADMIN examples. This is the command line utility that you can use to run Windows Server Backup. And then finally, we'll talk about Windows Complete PC Restore, which is not only for workstations, but also for servers. Alright, one of the best ways of restoring data in Windows Server 2008 is to use volume shadow copy. This is not new with Windows Server 2008, but it has been somewhat improved. Basically, this gives us kind of an on-the-fly restore, so that rather than having to dig through a whole bunch of tapes or something like that to recover data that might have been deleted, what we can do instead is to simply right-click on a file or folder and choose to restore previous versions. What this does is it allows you to schedule shadow copies that will back up on a regular basis. It creates these shadow copy backups of your data. Now, this is not just going to create shadow copies of your shares like Windows Server 2003 did. With that one, it was only shares that would actually back up. Now, in Windows Server 2008, as well as Vista, by the way, it actually creates shadow copies of all of the folders and all of the data on the hard drive. Now, you can also monitor it to restore the progress, that is, if you're restoring a large file. So if you've right-clicked on a file or a folder and you're trying to restore a large file and you get a little impatient with it, you can track what it's doing in terms of its percentage of restore by doing this from a command line, VSSAdmin, which is the volume shadow copy administration, and then query reverts. If you type all of that in, and I would make sure that you know about this, if you type all of that in, then it'll show you the progress that's going on in the restore process. So, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can configure the volume shadow copy service. Number one, you just need to access the disk. So, for example, here, I could right-click on disk management, choose all tasks, and then I could choose configure shadow copies. Okay, that's one way to do that. The other way is just through Windows Explorer. I could go to the disk itself, right-click here, and then again choose Configure Shadow Copies. They both bring me to the same interface, which we see right here. Now, once we get to this, what we need to do is not choose Enable right away. Okay, that's important, because if you choose Enable first, then you won't be able to modify the settings to your liking. So what you'll want to do first is to configure Settings, and then you'll specify the storage area that you want to use. Now, normally what we'll have is an additional hard drive that we can dedicate to volume shadow copy. You don't have to do that. You could just use whatever you have, but something is better than nothing. In this case, I've only got one drive here that's available. This other one is actually my backup, which I'll talk about after a while. I don't want to use that one. So I can only really use this one, and I can choose to use a limit to the volume shadow copy storage area or not. Okay. Now, the reason why you might want to use a limit, especially on a drive that's also being used for the operating system and data, is because you don't want to crowd your actual production files. All right. If it was a dedicated drive, maybe I had a drive E or something like that with a terabyte of storage, then what would happen is I could dedicate the whole thing to recovering the data, to the data recovery. And it used to be that you could only store up to about 2 months worth of data on a volume shadow copy, but I think in recent service packs that has since been lifted. So you should be able to store quite a lot of data back. And how far back you go in terms of the previous versions of a file is difficult to say, because it relates to how much storage space is available on the storage that you specify here. As it starts to run out of space, it'll do the first in, first out method for removing oldest data and replacing it with newer data. Okay? So then what I'll do is I'll choose the schedule, and I can specify how often I want to create a backup. Now what I do is I work 7 days a week, so I actually choose, yeah, don't laugh, I work 7 days a week, people. So I'll choose that item, and I'll say 7 o'clock every day of the week. And then I'll also specify an additional scheduled backup at some other date and time. And you just do whatever makes sense for you. Okay, if you want advanced scheduling, you can choose that. But we'll just go ahead and click OK here and OK. And then now it's ready to go. Once you've clicked OK on the second one, it now becomes enabled. And if I want to, I can create now. And that will create shadow copies of any of my shared folders. The result of that is going to be, if I accidentally delete a file out of a shared folder, then I can right-click on the folder and choose to go to restore a previous version. Or if I just accidentally overwrite a known good file with a bad copy of the file of the same file name, then I can right-click directly on the file name and choose to recover as well. You'll see that here in just a moment. I'll give it time to create its backup or create its shadow copy, and then we'll take a look at how it works. Okay, so now we see that it has created a shadow copy of that volume. Now, after it creates its first shadow copy, the rest of them are going to be block-based. So when it does its scheduled shadow copies, they're block-based, which makes them very fast and efficient. And I don't think you're really going to have a big hit in terms of performance. So now let's take a look at what we could do with this. If I go over to my local drive, and here's my DC Nugget 1 share, and I go into football pool here. This is one of the documents that I had been working with earlier. And I accidentally commit a horrible sin by replacing the word Cardinals with Steelers. Okay? Got to spell it right first, I guess. They're the ones that beat the Cardinals in the Super Bowl in 2009. So that's not good. And I just realized the horrible mistake I made, and I overwrote the document as well, so shucks. Now I'm stuck with Steelers. So how can I restore to the previous data? Well, I could right-click, choose Restore Previous Versions, and notice that it shows here a previous version that was made and the date and time. Now all I have to do is to choose Restore, choose Restore, and I've successfully restored a previous version, so now it goes back to the Cardinals. Yippee-ki-yay. All right. All right, I can't believe I just said yippee-ki-yay. But anyway, so now I've got the right version of the file. Likewise, if I had accidentally deleted the file like this, then now what do I do? Because there's nothing to right-click on. Well, then what I would do is I would right-click on the share itself and choose Restore Previous Versions. And then I would choose to open up this folder. And then now notice that this is not actually the folder that I was originally looking at. If I restore this, you'll see that that actual folder is here in the background. So what I could do here is to say, is this the one I want? I can actually double-click on it and open that shadow copy file. I see that's the file that I want. Now I can just drag that out and put it into my appropriate location. And now, once again, I've got the correct file. So a couple of different ways of going about this, and it's very easy to use. Even your generic users will be able to do this without a whole awful lot of effort if you give them just a little bit of training. And even if they can't, your help desk can probably do this whole thing for them, and it's much, much faster than restoring from tape. Now let's take a look at Windows Server Backup, which replaces the old NT backup. Remember, the old NT backup, which we've been using for over a decade in previous versions of Windows, created a full backup and then either a differential or incremental backup. Now, the differential or incremental backup would just back up any changes since the last backup. That's kind of putting it in the short version. But overall, it was not a really very efficient method for performing backup, and most companies, especially larger ones, would just purchase some third-party solution instead. So, now we have Windows Server Backup. This is probably still not suitable for large corporations that already have an established enterprise storage solution, but it's an excellent solution for small to medium-sized businesses or small offices like I've got. What we have with this is you need to commit your entire drives to the backup. Now, this is a little bit of a paradigm shift. Remember, from NT Backup and other backup products, you kind of pick and choose what you want. You can select individual files and folders to back up. You don't do that anymore. Now, you choose the entire source drive. So instead of choosing individual files and folders on drive C, you might need to commit all of drive C to the backup. So you just have to get used to that. Now, as I say that, I also want to point out that it's almost out right now, but Windows Server 2008 R2 goes back to the old method so that you can now choose individual files and folders if you want to. But Windows Server 2008 out of the box, you have to commit the entire drive. Now, for the destination, you also have to commit the entire drive, once again, except for Windows Server 2008 R2, which allows you to not dedicate the entire drive to the destination. But out of the box, the whole drive for the source, the whole drive for the destination. Okay, so that's just the way it's going to be, and that's also what's on the exam at the time of this recording. Another thing to keep in mind here is that you do not have any network backup and restore except for one-off. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of administrators in the past would have run their backup from a backup machine of some type, and it would look for backup shares or backup resources out there on the network. And then from their workstation, it could back up all those network shares to a network destination potentially. Now you can't do that. It only backs up local hard drives, okay? And it only backs up 2 local hard drives. Now the exception there, again, is one-off backup. So if I back up my drive to a network destination, it does allow me to do that, but only in a one-off backup, because if I back up again the next day thinking that I'm going to get something akin to an incremental or differential backup, that's not what's going to happen. What it does is it entirely overwrites that previous day's backup on the network. So again, for network backups, you only get one shot at those. One way to cheat this, however, if you want, is if you have a network-attached storage solution of some type, you can use the new iSCSI, which sends SCSI commands over Ethernet as if they were being sent over an iSCSI or over a SCSI cable, and therefore to the operating system they look like they're attached locally when indeed they're actually attached over the network. Okay, so that's just an exception for you. Not on the exam, but just as an FYI. Also, the Windows Server Backup is a block-based backup. What does this mean? Well, it means it's very fast and it's very efficient compared to previous backup methods. Let me show you how efficient it is, in fact. Remember we looked, I think this was in another nugget that we looked at earlier here on when we were talking about administering file systems, but I showed you a file that was really large. It was a big panorama that I had created from somewhere. I can't even remember where it was. But that one digital file, that image, was over a gigabyte in size. Let's say that this is the file right here, okay? And it is 1 gigabyte in size. Now I do a backup today to my destination here, and how much is it going to require? 1 gigabyte worth of storage space for that one file. Now let's say that tomorrow I come by and I realize, oops, I forgot to make one little change to that file, so I add a little bit of data to it. Maybe it's just 1K. Okay. Now, in the old traditional method of backup, how much would be required over here now? Well, it would be a changed file is all the backup solution would know, because there would be an archive bit that had been set saying I need to back up this whole thing again. So now it would back up 1 gigabyte plus the 1K, and now my total backup commitment here for this one file is 2 gigabytes plus 1K. All right, that's huge. And if I modify this file every day, then it's going to grow by a gigabyte every single day. Well, now if I kind of reverse all of this, what would happen with Windows Server 2008's backup is that it's block-based. So it still has my original backup from yesterday, and then when it looks at this, it only looks for changes, and it uses the volume shadow copy service to also work with this. But it only backs up pretty much the differences in the data itself. So now it's 1 gigabyte plus 1K, and there's a little bit of overhead there as well. So roughly, now for 2 days worth of backup, I have 1 gigabyte plus 1K for my total backup requirement, as opposed to 2 gigabytes. So it's much more efficient that way. Now, do be aware of the fact that since it's a block-based backup, it can be affected by a defragmentation run, because it juggles around the blocks themselves. So, if that's the case, and it's difficult to quantify, if I did a defragmentation of this drive between the time that I created my original backup and the time I added this 1K of data, then it might be that these blocks over here were also moved, and so it might actually need 1 gigabyte plus 1K plus 300 megabytes. I don't know. It's difficult to say. But anyway, just be aware of the fact that defragmentation will affect it. Now, there are a number of different ways to run a backup. You can run a backup from the console, okay, which we'll take a look at. You can run it remotely. That's really mostly going to be from a remote console, and like a remote desktop, for example. And you can also run it from a command line. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at how I would set that up. I've already set that up on the computer we're looking at, DC Nugget 1, and it makes a backup on a regular basis. But I'm going to go over here to DC Nugget 2, where I've just recently logged on, and I'm going to go down to storage, and we'll see that we don't have backup configured here quite yet. At least I don't think I put it on there. So if I go to Windows Server Backup, give it just a moment to wake up here. Then we see that no backup has been scheduled for this computer. I guess I actually did install it. If you haven't installed it yet, what you need to do is to go up here to the features and then choose add features. And what you'll do is you'll go down here to Windows Server Backup, and you can see I've already added these in. But I also always include the command line tools because they require very little space, and it'll give you the WBADMIN command line tool, which is actually a PowerShell script that you can use to manage backups. So anyway, now that we've got this all set up, I'll need to do a couple of other things as well. I need to specify what storage I need to use. So here under Disk Management, you see that I've got an additional disk that has never been online and it has not yet been initialized. So I'm going to right-click to choose Online, right-click to choose Initialize, and I'm just going to, make it alive, so to speak. And then I'm going to go to Windows Server Backup, and it should now be able to use that file, or rather that drive, for backup. So what you'll normally do is you'll create a backup schedule. You could do a backup once item, but that's not what normal administrators would do. We would create a schedule, and then if we wanted to make exceptions to our schedule, we could use the backup once item. So I'll choose backup schedule, and let this start to run. So it starts the wizard, and I just next my way through it. I'll specify whether I want the full server to back up or custom. I'll just choose custom so you can see the various options. But if I had additional drives here, I could select or deselect the checkboxes next to them. Since I've only got one drive and it's already selected, when I click on next, it's pretty much going to be the same as choosing the entire drive. Okay, or then the entire full server. But once I do that, I'll click on next, and then I'll choose the time of data backup. I'll just leave it at the default. And you can do more than once a day if you want. And that's actually not too bad an idea because since it's so efficient, it doesn't really cost you that much in terms of additional disk space. And then I'll click on Next, and I'll choose which drive I want to be the destination. And I've got this drive right here, and I'll click select it by checkbox and choose OK. Notice that I did have to choose Show All Available Disks. Normally, they don't all appear, so you do usually have to click that button. And then once I've done that, I'll click on Next. And then what it tells me here is that it'll no longer be available through Windows Explorer. It does not have an assigned drive letter, and the reason for that is because you don't normally want to mix and match your backup storage with ordinary file storage. So it's going to be dedicated for use to the backup utility here, and I'll just go ahead and click on Yes. And then I'll click on Next and Finish. And then the next thing I will do is to format the disk, and when it's done, I'll go ahead and create a backup so you can see one in progress. And then when it's done with the formatting of the disk, I'll just choose Close here, and then that'll pretty much be it. Now that disk will be committed to only the backup process. Notice, in fact, if I go to Disk Management, it will appear, but it does not have a drive letter or anything like that. Instead, what it is it's labeled according to the date and time that I dedicated it to the backup, and so you can see it right there. It also says Disk 1. What's that about? Well, you can add additional disks to this if you want. So if I go back to my backup schedule, for example, and select that, then it'll give me an option to add additional disks. So I can modify the backup, click on Next, and then I could just, again, full server is already pretty much selected, but I'll just choose Custom for the time being. And then what I can do here is to add more disks. This is very useful because what I'll often do is I'll have 2 or more disks available, and then I'll just plug one in. It'll do its nightly backup. I'll come back the next morning, I'll unplug that one, and I'll plug in another one and take one of them off-site. So that way I have 2 kind of rolling backup media available. That way also, if one of the backup media fails, one of the drive has a problem or something, then I still have another drive available just in case. I'm going to just cancel that for the time being. So very handy for that. Now if I want to go ahead and create my backup, I simply click Backup once. And then I'll choose the same options or different options. That would pretty much be the same things to select from that you saw when I first went through the wizard. But then I would simply click on Next and Backup. And now it'll go ahead and create its backup here after it creates its shadow copy volumes. Alright, that backup was still taking longer than I wanted it to, so I canceled it. That's why it says it failed right here. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a look at how we can actually use this, though. Remember our football pool document here? Well, what if I accidentally deleted it permanently so that it didn't even go into recycle bin? Now, how do I restore that? Well, I can go into Server Manager, and I can choose Recover. Having gone here, then, I could choose to recover data from this server, okay, and then click Next. Then you'll see that the bold shows me any other previous days where there has been a backup made of this server. Now here I'm only going to choose the most recent one, which is the 27th. Click on Next. and I can choose files and folders or entire volumes. If I want to do all of drive C, which is the operating system volume, then I would have to boot from the Windows Server 2008 DVD, but I don't want to do that. I just want to get data, so I'll click on Next. Having done that, I'm then going to expand out this local server, and I'm going to go to DC Nugget 1 Share, and Football Pool, click on Next. Then I can restore it to its original location. And you see here that I can also choose another location. I can just put it there. I can also create copies so that I have both versions of the file or folder if I have multiple versions in the destination. Override existing copies, or do not recover files and folders that already exist in the recovery destination. Then I can also restore the security settings, which is usually a good idea. Now I'm just going to click Next Recover, and then click on Close. I'll let it do its thing, and when it's done, I'll now have my file back. So I go back into this, and there, sure enough, is my football pool document. So we're back in business. Alright, now let me also show you some command line functions that you could do with this as well. So if I run this as an administrator, then I can use the WBADMIN command prompt. So WBADMIN, and then I could just do a start backup, and that would again pretty much be the same thing as if I were to click right here where it shows backup once, and then I would press enter, and then it would just run the backup, okay, with my existing schedule that I had already configured. I could custom modify this though to do additional items. So I could do WBADMIN start backup, and then I could do a dash, all critical. Now that would be all critical drives, and meaning any drive that had operating system data on it, such as the boot and or system drives. Normally those appear on the same drive. Normally that's drive C, but they can be split up into different drives. In any case, we'll choose all critical here, and then I would choose a backup target, colon, and then, let's say drive letter E. Maybe that's a CD or a DVD drive. Okay, then I could also do a quiet so it doesn't prompt me. And then if I pressed enter there, it would start the backup to drive letter E. And this could be outside of my normal scheduled backup. Maybe my scheduled backup drive, backs up to drive, well, actually it doesn't back up to drive letter, does it? It backs up to a dedicated volume. So this would back up to a specific drive letter. Now let me give you another clue with this. If I wanted to back up only the system state data, but the backup target drive E, let's say that was a DVD drive or a CD drive, then what I would have to do is I would have to actually choose this all critical item. And the reason for that is you cannot back up only the system state, which includes things such as the Active Directory database and other critical components of the operating system. Well, you can't back that up to removable media. Okay, so once again, if this were a DVD and I wanted only the system state, I would have no choice but to choose all critical, which would include the system state and all the operating system files and lots of other stuff. Okay, very important. I would keep this definitely in mind. Okay, now if I did have the capability, maybe I have another drive somewhere, and I wanted to only back up the system state, but it was not to removable media, then what I could do is do a WBADMIN, and then I could do a start system. Did I type that right? No, wrong. System state backup hyphen backup target colon, and then whatever drive letter is a hard drive or something like that, F or something like that, and then that would back up only the system state backup. Now let's also take a look here at how I can use the command line to recover an entire folder and its contents if I want, if I have deleted those. So let's say that here I've accidentally deleted this. I'm going to hold down Shift to not send this to the recycle bin, and then I'll just go ahead and delete that. Oops! Now I need to get that back. I think there was a couple of certificates in there or something like that. And now what I would need to do is to actually recover that data. And I would do that by doing the WBADMIN command, start recovery. Again, it's easier if I just use the UI, so I can just click my way through it. But if you need to do it from a command line, this is the way you would do it. So start recovery, and then version. Now, how do I know what version I'm going to use? Actually, let me cancel this, and I'll show you. If I use a WBADMIN get versions, then it shows me the versions of the backup that have been made. It's real easy to make a mistake here, however, because what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to enter in the date and time that the backup was made. So it's tempting to look at this and say, okay, 6/27/2009, 2:30 a.m. Okay, that's what I'm going to use. Don't do that. And also, don't use this date and time. Okay, that was the date that the backup media was committed to the backup. Okay, that's when I committed this hard drive to backup purposes. The one I want is the version identifier right here. So, wow, there's 3 total dates. You got to make sure you use the last one there under version identifier. Now, let me go back to what I had here. Now, what we'll do here is once I've identified that, WBADMIN start recovery version and then the exact date and time stamp. Item type is file. Even though it's a folder, I would still specify file for the type that I want to restore. Items is C:\certs. That's the actual name of the folder that I want to recover. And I want to override, if there's any data there already, my override option there would be, in this case, to overwrite it. There's really nothing there, so it really wouldn't matter in my case. Recursive means to also restore any subfolders and any of their contents. And then quiet simply means to not prompt me to do it. So then I'll press enter, and it'll go ahead and do its thing. Now this whole command line syntax that you see up here, I would be aware of that for exam purposes, because that's the kind of thing that I would suspect could possibly be on the exam. So then after we're done here, it tells us that it did restore it. Let's go back and see that if it did or not. Oops, doesn't look like it. Let me press F5 to refresh. There it is. So now I've got the certs, and there's my cert in there. Okay, I guess I only had one certificate. Now, the thing that this does not restore for you is the share permissions. So it would have to go back in here and share this out again. But otherwise, the data itself is now intact and restored. Now finally, let's conclude with a couple of additional items. Number one, you can do an application recovery depending upon the application. They may not all take to this. But what you can try to do is, let's say that you've got an existing server where you've been running an application like Windows SharePoint Services. Then something goes wrong and you want to move the Windows SharePoint Services to some other server. What you can do is to take a backup that's been made from that Windows SharePoint Services server, go to the destination, choose WBADMIN Start Recovery. You can do that from a command line, and then you'll restore to that new server. Then what you'll do is install the application, Windows SharePoint Services and all of its accompanying features that you might need. And then once you've done that, it should already have all of the data and everything that it needs to for its configuration right there. So that's just an example of one way that you can also work with this. And again, may not work exactly like that with all applications, but I would definitely be aware of the fact that you could possibly do that here. So that would be with the WBADMIN Start Recovery option there. And then you can also work with a complete PC restore. Now that doesn't sound much like a server. PC sounds like, a client operating system. However, you can actually use this with a server to do a bare metal restore. So once again, maybe my server caught on fire and now I had to completely replace it. I can actually do a complete PC restore, obviously, on identical hardware, but it actually even works pretty well on different brands of hardware. We've actually tested this a few different times. So what I would do here is I would boot from a DVD. Now this has to be a Windows Vista or a Windows Server 2008 DVD. And it doesn't really matter which one I use. What does matter is if I'm trying to restore a 64-bit operating system, then I have to boot from a 64-bit media, and likewise from a 32-bit, then I have to boot from an x86 media. Okay, but I can actually restore a server by booting from Windows Vista DVD. Then in the startup process there, I'll choose to repair as opposed to doing a new installation, and then I'll select to do a complete PC restore. Then I select which backup to use, and then once you're done, the system will reboot, and you'll now have your operating system entirely on that new machine. In this nugget, we took a look at file services. This was part 4 where we started with a look at the volume shadow copy. Now this is a great way to keep kind of a running backup of snapshots of your data, which you can then quickly and easily recover if you need to at a later point in time. It has an indefinite past, however, because you don't really know how long or how far back your volume shadow copy is going to last. So you need a more long-term solution, which would be something like the Windows Server Backup, which will also give you things such as a bare metal restore, for example. Now with this, we took a look at an overview of Windows Server Backup and what it can do for you, and then we took a look at how to configure its backup. Then we actually created a backup, and we restored it in using a demo here. And then we took a look at some command line WBADMIN examples for using that utility. And then finally, we took a look at complete PC restore, which is a way of doing a bare metal restore from a backup that you've made. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.